This program is brought to you by Emory University.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the second part of our conference. I am delighted to welcome the folks on stage to talk to you about the future of environmental law. I'm going to let Ann Hurd, who's moderating this panel and who also happens to be one of my all-time favorite people, do the introductions. But just so y'all have kind of a run of the show for the way things that are going to go, this panel will run an hour and a half. We will then have very, 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 very brief closing remarks. And then there will be cake out back to celebrate the clinic's anniversary, the anniversary of the Goldman Prize, and the anniversary of Love Canal. So please feel free to stick around as long as you want after, eat cake, and catch up with your friends. It's been, for me, so great to see so many of y'all reconnect over lunch. So with that, I'm going to let Ann take it away.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. First, I want to thank Mindy for having me here today. It is a pleasure to be back home at Emory. I think this is the first time I've been in Tull Auditorium. Since I graduated law school a few years ago. So it's great. It hasn't changed a lot. So this afternoon's panel is going to be on the future of environmental law, frontiers in advocacy and protection in a time of conflict and change. And we have a very esteemed panel assembled today to talk with you about this topic. You don't really have to look very far to see that the environment today is a major issue with record temperatures around the globe, increasing frequency and ferocity of weather events, species decline. In the last 40 years, we've lost half our wildlife population, so that we know environmental protection is a real issue today. Nor do you have to look far to see that there are weaknesses in the systems that we have in place to address the protection of human health and our environment. You can look at the Flint water crisis, the Gulf of Mexico dead zone, the Pacific Ocean garbage pack, the Tennessee coal ash spill, and something we've talked about earlier today, the North Birmingham pollution problem, where residents there are living with the residuals of the coal industry. And these are just a few. We could go on and on with the environmental changes. And so our panel today is going to talk about where we started, where we are, and what our future can be with your energies and the energies of many of the others in our neighborhoods and communities who are equally concerned about the direction of our environmental policy and our environmental protection. On today's panel, we have William W. Busbee, Professor of Law, Georgetown University Law Center. And I'm going to follow Mindy's model from this morning and not go into their numerous credentials and accolades, but I would be remiss if I didn't say that Professor Busbee was the founder or instrumental in the founding of the clinic here. So for that, we are very, 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 very grateful. Our second panelist is Gwendolyn Fleming, and she is a partner in Van Ness Feldman, LLP, and she's a former EPA Chief of Staff. She's also a former regional administrator for EPA Region 4 and has a lot of firsthand experience about North Birmingham if you choose to ask her about that during our question and answer session. And finally, we have Michael Sutton, Executive Director of the Goldman Environmental Foundation. So with that, we are going to go in reverse order. Michael is going to be up first and talk with us, and Gwen will be next, and Bill will be final in our panel. And then I'll ask a few questions just to get us kick-started, and then we'll take questions from the audience as time allows. So with that, I'll turn it over.
And thank you, Mindy, and the clinic, and congratulations on your 20th anniversary. Thanks for the terrific lunch, too. So, Ann asked me to go first, I think, for a couple of reasons. Knowing that you all were going to fall asleep right after lunch, she asked me to kind of punch it up a little bit and show a few slides. The other reason that I'm here is to represent the Western United States. You might have noticed that most of our panelists this morning were from the East, and I don't want to remind you where most of the natural resources of this country are located, but it may not be in close proximity here. So you'll forgive me if I represent my side of the country rather assertively. I live on the Central California coast, work in San Francisco, but the Goldman Foundation, as Mindy said earlier, we award the Nobel Prize for the Environment on 6 continents every year. Lois was one of our original prize winners 30 years ago in 1990. We've had almost 200 prize winners from almost 90 countries ever since then. And they are people like Lois, remarkable people doing incredible work on behalf of the environment. But you all are that as well. I also want to talk about the more interesting side of environmental law. I practice natural resources law. Natural resources law needs you as much as pollution and toxics and so forth. And I happen to think it's just as interesting. My friend Bruce Babbitt, who was the Interior Secretary under Bill Clinton, he once said, quote, "History informs us time and time again that the best way to protect an environmental law is to use it vigorously, especially on public lands, lands that belong to all of us, the American people," unquote. So when we talk about the future of environmental law, our first responsibility is to use the laws that we have aggressively, as Lois encouraged us to do. You're going to hear a lot more about environmental law. I want to turn to public lands. I want to turn to wildlife. I want to turn to endangered species and that side of environmental law. And when we look to California, we get a glimpse of the future, because in our state, we have a political situation now. We just elected a new governor. We have a Democratic supermajority in both houses of the legislature. We can do things politically in California that we can't do anywhere else in the nation. Somebody has to go first. We gave the world airbags and seatbelts, and we can give the world environmental law as well, and have. So I'm gonna show you that. California is not only the 5th largest economy in the world, but we have, outside of Silicon Valley, outside of Hollywood, we have some of the greatest biodiversity in the United States. More total species, more endemic species than any other state in the nation. We have 3% of the US land surface, but we have 30% of the biodiversity of the United States. So we have to take care of it. I want to make 3 quick points this afternoon in the time I have. One is, our environmental laws have been working pretty well over the years, and I'll give you a couple of examples of that. The second point is, governments have exercised enormous flexibility in implementing those statutes, and that is also working really well. The third point is, to the point of our panel, our body of natural resources and environmental laws has to evolve to remain relevant into the next century. And I'll give you a couple of examples like that as well. There are really 2 main periods of the evolution of our natural resources law. The first one was at the turn of the last century. These are a bunch of market hunters in Northern California. You used to be able to buy a wild duck dinner in Atlanta or San Francisco or any city around the US, because these guys were out shooting all the ducks and geese they could. Tons, literally hundreds of tons of wild game meat was going to the restaurants in the United States. We stopped that in the early part of the 19th century with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1916, the Lacey Act of 1900. President Theodore Roosevelt at the time started declaring national wildlife refuges, national forests. Congress passed the Antiquities Act, so the president can set aside national monuments and protect land. All of that was done at the early part of the 20th century. We stopped that later in the 20th century, in the 1960s and 70s. We began to protect public lands. Now, about 50% of the land surface of California is protected in one way or another. 50% of the state has been set aside as state parks, national forests, national parks, national wildlife refuges, and so forth and so on. So we've done a pretty good job, the Forest Service, the Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and so forth. In the 60s and 70s, under another Republican president, Richard Nixon, we began to pass environmental statutes, the National Environmental Protection Act, NEPA in 1969, the Marine Mammal Protection Act in 1972, the Coastal Zone Management Act, the Endangered Species Act. All of those statutes were enacted at right around the same time. We turned Los Angeles from the smog capital of the world into a beautiful city with mountains in the background. We brought back a species that's so ugly it's beautiful, the California condor. From the brink of extinction, we had to take them all into the Los Angeles Zoo, breed them in captivity, release them. Now there are hundreds in the wild in Southern California and Arizona. And you can see them if you visit our state. We protected our coast. California recently declared the largest network of marine reserves in the nation. The Coastal Zone Management Act, our Magnuson Stevens Act, our fisheries statute. We've actually begun to take really good care of our resources, and we can be proud of that. Doesn't mean the job is finished, but to put it in perspective, we've actually done a pretty damn good job. Our fisheries are recovering from past overfishing and our lack of foresight. The Magnuson Stevens Act now is a strong, and most of the coastal states have strong fisheries statutes as well. California Marine Life Management Act, the best state fishery statute in the nation. We should be proud of that. The Marine Mammal Protection Act brought species that were shot nearly into extinction, like the sea otter, again, back from the brink. And now, while this species is still listed as threatened, you can see them every day off where I live in the Monterey Peninsula. So we should be proud of what we have accomplished. Here's some data for you. This is the progress of extinctions in my state, and you can see the two plateaus here. When we passed that first tranche of environmental laws back at the turn of the last century, extinctions leveled off. 1970, we have not had a single extinction in California since 1970. And again, that is something we can be proud of. So our environmental laws are working. They are doing what we intended them to do, and we should be proud of that. By the way, since 1970, we've gone from 12 million people in California to 40 million people in California and not suffered a single extinction in the meantime. That, by any stretch of the imagination, is a big victory for our environmental laws, and we should be proud of that. There is work to be done. I think part of the reason our environmental statutes and natural resources laws have been so successful is that we have exercised enormous flexibility in interpreting and implementing them. The Endangered Species Act, one of the best examples of that. We have habitat conservation plans now that allow for development in one place as long as there's compensatory mitigation in another. It's controversial. Business community doesn't always like it, but it's working. I'll give you another example. The sage grouse depends on sagebrush habitat all across the American West. Threatened by oil and gas development in places like Wyoming and Montana, the mere threat of the listing of the sage grouse was enough to get the states of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming to voluntarily agree to protect millions of acres of habitat for that bird. Now, the current administration, we won't mention the name, as Pat encouraged us, is beginning to chip away at progress like this. But the fact is, our federal environmental statutes, like the Endangered Species Act, have encouraged the states to step up and do things that they would otherwise not have done. I don't need to remind you how conservative the Intermountain states are. The West Coast states, Oregon, Washington, and California, are solidly blue. Not so much the Intermountain states. Very, very conservative. Places like Wyoming, Montana, Idaho are run by, are deep red states, and they are not inclined to protect wildlife over oil and gas development unless they're compelled to do so, and they have been by the Endangered Species Act. So that flexibility that we have exercised, that innovation in implementing our statutes is being threatened by the current administration, but that will pass as well. We have, over the years, my third point, my final point, improved our environmental statutes dramatically. And there's no better example of that than the Magnuson Stevens Act, our principal fisheries statute. It was enacted in the 1970s to Americanize the fisheries, kick out all the foreign fleets and bring in the American fishermen. But what it did is replace foreign overfishing with American overfishing. Well, we've changed that now. In the last 20 years, we've implemented amendments to the Magnuson Stevens Act to make it a conservation and sustainability statute. And now our fish populations are rebounding, sport fisheries are better off, commercial fisheries are better off, the ocean ecosystem is better off as well. And that's just one example of where we've made progress. Do we need new authority to protect our natural resources, our environment? Well, the first step is to use our existing statutes more effectively on behalf of the environment, but that may not always be enough. And again, California has pioneered climate change legislation, both to encourage adaptation and mitigation. We don't have a federal cap and trade program, but we do in California. We don't have a trust fund for the oceans nationally. We do in California. So again, we are trying to show the way for the federal government, and sometimes they pay attention. We may well need new legislation, new authority to protect our environment going forward. Here's a rebuttable presumption for you. It's my sense that most of our natural resources laws that were passed 50 years ago now are better at, in fact, they were originally intended to address proximate threats to our natural resources, not ultimate threats like this. And so we are getting more and more Endangered Species Act petitions, for example, based on climate change, climate modeling, but the Endangered Species Act wasn't written to address climate change, and it's very limited in what it can do. And so how is our jurisprudence, how is our body of legislation going to evolve with new threats? When these statutes were passed, nobody was talking about climate change. Nobody knew what environmental justice meant or thought it was important. And yet, those are the challenges of today. Our legislation and our statutes have to respond to that. So we may need, indeed need new authority, and California is trying to model that for the rest of the nation. We've done something else that bears mentioning in passing, and that is we have figured out how to pay for all this. As my friends in Sacramento and Washington, D.C. remind me, it doesn't do much good to pass new statutes and lots of new authority without creating a mechanism to fund it. If you don't pay for it, it doesn't happen, right? We have lots of great laws on the books that don't actually get implemented in practice. And so we have trust funds, we have bond acts. There are lots of innovative ways to pay for natural resources. Hunting and fishing used to pay the bill for conservation in the US. Not so much anymore because hunting and fishing are declining. And we need to find new ways. Some states have sales tax increases they use to pay the bill. We need to do that. My final point is about politics. Lois mentioned this morning that science and law can inform decision-making, but they're seldom dispositive, and we shouldn't expect them to be dispositive. I was appointed by Governor Schwarzenegger twice to a state commission that dealt with natural resources in California. All environmental decisions are quintessentially political, and we should expect that. Science and law doesn't mean they're irrelevant. It just means they seldom carry the day, and we shouldn't expect them to. As Lois said earlier, politics is what carries the day, and most of us lawyers and scientists are really bad at playing politics. The good news is, if you have the votes, you can do anything. You can accomplish a lot. Politics is only a problem if you don't have the votes. If you have the votes, politics is great, and it can be used to great advantage. So Sometimes we see the pendulum of leadership swing away from Washington, D.C. I'm old enough to have worked in the Reagan administration, Bush II, now the current administration. And we've seen the pendulum, when the good guys are in the White House or in power in Washington, we have great national leadership on the environment. When they're not, we have great opportunities for state leadership on behalf of the environment, and that's something that we can all make happen as well. So thank you very much, and look forward to the discussion.
Good afternoon, how are you? Ooh, I think we need more coffee outside for folks. There's more coffee. Mindy wanted me to let you know. I'm going to pick up where Mike left off, talking about playing politics. That is something that I've done for the last 25 years since graduating here at Emory. And the way I look at it is it's not so much playing big P politics, D versus R, but the small town politics. Understanding the motivations and influencers in people's lives, and then knowing all of that, getting them to do what you want them to do anyway. That's how I define politics somewhat. But as I think about the charge question, or the frontiers in advocacy and protection in times of conflict and change, I'm reminded of a quote that should be very familiar to a lot of you. And so I want to start off with this. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the winter of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. When I stop and think about conflict and change and this opening from Charles Dickens' novel, Tale of Two Cities, it could actually be the tale of two environmental perspectives. One of the things that I realized as I look at this question through a policy development lens is, and again, you can imagine which end of the spectrum I may think we are in currently, having been an Obama appointee for 6 years in my career. Knowing that as much as I personally feel for the environment and believe in environmental protection, there are others on the other side who vehemently think the other way. And as a policy development person, part of what your job is trying to bridge that gap, trying to narrow it. And while we need great lawyers out doing the good fight, litigating on behalf of various causes and ensuring that the laws are followed. And again, I started my career as a prosecutor and did that for 17 years. So enforcement is something I strongly believe in. There's also the notion that for every great lawyer that you have outside an agency, you need a great one inside, or someone who understands the way the agency works to help you affect change and make the decisions from the inside. And so I've been tremendously blessed in my career to serve in several roles where I've gotten to do that, particularly at EPA, first as the regional administrator for 3 years, and then serving as Gina McCarthy's chief of staff for her first 2 years. And it was during those 2 years that we fashioned the Clean Water Rule, obviously the Clean Power Plan, definition of solid waste. And as you stop and think about all of the various inputs, particularly from the community, both of the administrators that I had the pleasure to work for, starting with Lisa Jackson, and then obviously Gina McCarthy, were very committed to making sure that the community had a seat at the table. It was one of the reasons that Lisa Jackson hired me, particularly here in Region 4, to address the environmental justice concerns that were here. And so as I think about advocacy and protection, and the opportunity to do that from inside an agency as opposed to outside, recognizing that there's still a lot of conflict and change, there are two areas that I wanted to talk about today, two substantive frontiers. And then spend a little time talking about lessons learned, other pragmatic ways that we advise clients, or I advise clients now, in terms of how you would affect change if you're on the outside, knowing what I know about the agency inside. So the two substantive frontiers are what we affectionately called next generation enforcement, or next gen, while we were with the agency. Instituted by Cynthia Giles. And then stopping and looking at states in particular, like Mike said, when you are in the situation that you're in currently, there's a real opportunity for state leadership. And we're starting to see a lot of states look at their environmental rights amendments, looking at their constitutions and identifying ways to be able to have those tools work for the benefit of environmental protection. So turning to Next Gen, I think many of you know that when Lisa Jackson came into the agency, and just to give you a little bit of background, she came in, she was nominated December of 2008. The Kingston spill in Tennessee had just happened. It was one of the very first things she was questioned about during her confirmation hearing. Senator Boxer in particular asked her to look at coal ash and the needs of the community specifically. She was also asked about air quality in Birmingham. And so those were two of the things that were on her mind from the beginning of her tenure at the agency. And with those facts as the backdrop, she came up with a three-legged value statement for the agency. We're going to follow the best science, we're going to adhere to the rule of law, and we're going to increase transparency. And it's really that last one that I think, thankfully, we are still seeing the benefits of today, because as people have information, as people know what is around them, what they're being exposed to, what they are having to encounter, they are then empowered to be able to make choices and informed decisions and actually affect politics and policy in a way to their benefit, as opposed to them just being ignored, and even worse, not understanding why they're being ignored. And so one of the things that Lisa had asked Cynthia to do was come up with this next generation compliance method, where you would use the advances in technology to be able to decrease pollution by having both the company or the industry know what was going on in real time, so they could no longer say, well, we didn't know that that discharge was happening for X weeks and months. If you're monitoring every day, then you know. It also allowed for the monitoring reports to be uploaded and available via website. It's where you've got things like ECHO, the Enforcement, Compliance, and Historic Information History Online. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that at EPA, but it's a fabulous resource to be able to know and understand what's happening in your community. You can look at it through zip codes or by a facility name. And so again, these were just the different ways that the goal was to provide information and accountability at the same time. They did it through tools such as advanced monitoring. You heard Lois Gibbs talk about the various tools where you could take infrared pictures of various, whether it's fence line monitoring or beyond the fence line monitoring, to know what is actually coming out and going into the air. It also launched an independent third-party verification system. So again, when you stop and think about, not only are these beneficial to the environment to be able to have this information, but also think about the industries that you are now creating in terms of the innovation that you're spurring and people recognizing this need and building businesses around being able to provide this information and or provide this third-party certification. The electronic reporting is one of the ways that we got to e-manifest and a lot of the other requirements to have companies report their data online so that not only would EPA know whether they are in compliance, but the community would know. And they would be able to have the information necessary to notify either EPA or the state if things were not in compliance. And again, all of that leads to this notion of public accountability. And for those companies that were doing the right thing, it was a way to confirm that they were doing the right thing and in an effort to build trust with their community partners. Obviously, the benefits, in addition to improving trust in the community, it shared information. It allowed everybody to be on the same playing field as opposed to some knowing the information and some, particularly environmental justice communities, not knowing the information. One of the other things that Cynthia did at the time was make sure that these tools and this notion of next-gen compliance was built into the enforcement network. And so in terms of enforcement settlements, it was a default provision that you were to provide some type of innovation in your settlement documents, which would then hopefully lead through to the permitting documents. So again, you're fostering this notion of public compliance. And while that aspect may not be enforced in this current arena, the information's out there. They can't take it down. And so that's one of the reasons why I look at it as the next opportunity. We talked about citizen science earlier, particularly for environmental justice communities. You've got apps, How's My Waterway, and all of these other things where you can look and see and be able to know what are you being impacted by. And with that information, you can decide, is there something that you want to do about it? Is there somebody that you want to partner with to be able to make sure you either get more information and or stop whatever should not be going on or is adversely affecting your health? So moving to the second point in terms of the state environmental rights amendments, it was interesting, the big one that's in the news, and I serve as the co-chair of the Environmental Justice Subcommittee for the ABA, a SEER in particular, the section on energy and environment resources. The interesting thing here is we just did a panel about Pennsylvania and its ERA and the litigation, or particularly the case that turned Pennsylvania's thoughts around about environmental protection as it relates to it being an inalienable right. The interesting thing, if you know the history, this particular constitutional provision was actually passed in 1969. In 1971, it was offered in 1969 by a state legislator, Franklin Curry, who's still alive, and it was done in response to a lot of the coal pollution that was throughout the country, or throughout the Pennsylvania area. But it was passed as a bipartisan measure, and then pretty much laid dormant for almost 40 years. Which obviously was frustrating to those that took the initiative and tried to get this done, particularly in light of the fact that from 65 to 71, Pennsylvania passed more environmentally friendly statutes than any other time in its history. Much like the situation with Love Canal, CERCLA, a lot of people in the country were paying attention to environmental concerns at the time. But as soon as it was passed, this constitutional amendment, it was immediately watered down, indicating that it could only be enacted by a three-part test that was largely at the control of the legislature. Eventually, in late 2013 or early 2014, a Republican judge is the one that actually revived this constitutional amendment and brought it to the fore, indicating that the act that was challenging it, and it was relating to the Marcellus Shale, Act 13, which was an act to pretty much allow oil and gas companies to drill almost anywhere. And so it was interesting, the Attorney General of the state is arguing against his own constitutional amendment, and the Chief Justice, through a plurality opinion, called him to the carpet and indicated, this is a constitutional amendment. It needs to be raised to the level of all of the constitutional amendments, including the right to free speech, the right to be able to practice your religion, and it is not relegated to second-tier status in any way, the way the previous cases had done. It's still in debate as to where this particular decision will go and what will happen with this constitutional amendment, but it's putting us on the path. And again, I added as terms of talking a little bit about our history to know and understand where we're going in terms of our future. I do think we're going to see more litigation and more opportunities on the state level as other governors and other state legislatures, like obviously California and other places, start to realize the opportunity that they have in the absence of any type of federal action. One of the places that that's happening is in New Jersey. They've now also filed their own version of a constitutional amendment that tracks the Pennsylvania language, and I think we can start to see that happen more prevalently. But one of the reasons it's incredibly important that we start finding creative ways to play on this new frontier is because when you talk about environmental justice, that's a notion that comes out of obviously Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, but it's largely rooted in an executive order, 12898, that was issued by President Clinton, and it created an overarching advisory board, if you will, of cabinet secretaries from now 17 different agencies. But environmental justice is not contained in a statute anywhere. It's not contained in a regulation anywhere. Everybody relates back to this particular executive order, and that's again why I go back to the importance of policy development. In the absence of any kind of overarching statute or regulation to be able to address the needs of communities, You have to get creative if you're inside, but we also need you fighting from the outside. When you talk about playing politics and counting votes, one of the pragmatic recommendation that I have for people is that you learn to play chess. Not only just chess on one level, but you learn to play multi-level chess. And many of my colleagues from EPA that are here have heard me say this, because you've constantly got to stop and think about not only what's happening at either the state level, you got to think about the federal level, you've got to think about the local level, you've got to think about what's happening in the community, what industry is with you or against you and why, what are they looking towards. And in order to kind of address that conundrum, this multi-level chess, you're also constantly having to think 5 moves ahead and anticipate who's going to say what if you go in this direction, how are they going to try to counter you. And so one of the other things that we recommend is that you look for the unusual suspects or the non-traditional partners in your work to be able to help you navigate this multi-level chessboard and be able to affect change and weigh influence in areas that you might not normally be able to speak. Obviously, as litigators, your battlefield is the courtroom. Recognize that there are other people in different areas that can also be there helping you count your votes, helping you affect change by influencing the various policymakers that you need to get to. Recently, I was struck by an article it was a tweet actually, by the Nature Conservancy of the top 10 influencers to watch to affect climate change in the future. And as you look at the list, or before you looked at the list, you think that you would be able to name easily 10 people that would be influencers in this space. But interestingly enough, the #1 group that was listed were teenagers and Instagram. Think about how you can partner with other folks. They talked about weather forecasters, obviously mayors in the absence of the Paris Agreement. There are other people that still want to advance your cause, and the key is to connect with them in ways that you bolster your case while also mitigating or minimizing the opposition from any opponents. Another one that's on that list in the top 5 was investors. A lot of investors are now starting to look at a company's footprint in terms of their sustainability, in terms of their climate plans and other things. It's another opportunity to be able to speak to a larger audience in order to get whatever outcome you're looking for from a particular agency. So as I begin to take my seat again, pragmatically, think about who your partners are. Who are the non-traditional partners that you can go to that you can partner with? Think about the new and different ways or the new and different audiences that you can take your goals to, your initiatives, and what you want done. And then always remember that as wonderful it is to have great litigators on the outside of the agencies, we need you to be able to turn around and come back into the agencies at the right time as well and help us affect change from the inside.
Well, hello everyone. So I'm Bill Busbee, used to be on the faculty here, and so before I launch into my remarks about environmental law's future, I just want to say a couple things that as someone who helped launch the clinic, one, people kept saying like, I launched the clinic and that's not accurate. So I just want to make the record straight here, which is I helped launch the clinic. And just because it's a good example of how cooperation and exploration of better ways to do things can work, what really happened was the Upper Chattahoochee Riverkeeper was working. They didn't have quite the resources they needed to handle some of the challenging matters they wanted. The then General Counsel, David Moore, said, I knew him some actually from music. I used to be the 6th person off the bench for the blues band, the Non-Essentials. Yes, I know. Many of you really enjoyed our 6 shows. But in any event, David said, Bill, how about you set up essentially an adjunct to the Riverkeeper? And I said, I don't think that would ever happen, and we don't have any active clinics right now at Emory. And then Rutherford Seidel, who's involved in the Turner Foundation, who was also involved in the Riverkeeper in setting it up, said, there must be some way we can partner up. And so we started talking, and I brought the then Dean, Howard Hunter, into it, and kind of came up with a vision for the clinic. And then the Turner Foundation provided the critical seed grant to get us going, and it was quite substantial by standards of the time. And so it really got rolling, and it's become ever better. And so it's really a cooperative thing, and it's a thrill to be sitting here. Julie Mayfield, a past director, is here. Mary McLean Asbill is here. I don't know where she's sitting right now. There she is in the back. Jim Grody, a past director, is here. Larry Sanders is in Vietnam, a past director, so he couldn't get here. But each of them kind of remade the clinic some based on their interests and their expertise. And I really think every single major environmental group in the Atlanta area and really the region, and some major national groups, most of them actually at this point, have relied on the clinic to do critical work. So it really is a thrill to watch something that's thrived so. And Mindy Goldstein, no one ever really bragged about her today, but she has been remarkable here. And now that I'm at Georgetown, and now that I'm at Georgetown, I'm in Washington, and every time I tell people I've been there, they go, "Oh, do you know Mindy Goldstein? She's phenomenal." And really, she has a national reputation, and so does Emory because of all the work it's done. So I'm just happy to be here. And I have to say, at a personal level, I'm a co-author of Environmental Casebook, and we have our Lois Gibbs discussion within it, and it's a thrill to have her here. You know, this is really a genuine American hero who changed law, who changed banking, changed finance, changed chemical waste management, and all because of her having such courage and stick-to-itiveness. So it's thrilled to have her here. So now I'm going to bore you to tears. So, okay. So I was thinking about this, and I actually prepared two sets of remarks, and one was just going to be the future of embattled environmental law, and I thought, and then I thought, but I'm very immersed in all these battles going on in Washington and the regulatory rollbacks by Darth Vader. Sorry, President Trump, but the Voldemort, whatever. But in any event, I digress. But in any event, as I thought about this, I've again and again been struck by what I think is an interesting little thought exercise, which is, are we thinking about the environment in the same way a prudent investor would think about being a steward of money? Okay? Now, I'm going to stop for a second. Some people say, don't talk about the environment and money because one's really mostly about citizenship and one is about just earning money, and I think there is a risk to monetizing. But I actually think it's a valuable exercise. So I'm just going to kind of talk through it, how it works or it doesn't, and I think it points out both why our environmental laws are great, as was stated, but also why the current moves are so dangerous and potentially devastating to our democracy, to the environment, and maybe even to long-term stability and the health of the world in connection with climate change. So there's a joke where, I think the basic joke is someone says, I found a $20 bill on the sidewalk, and the economist will say, no, that's impossible. There are no $20 bills sitting on a sidewalk. They would never be there. No one leaves money on the table. And economists think it's really funny. I've never thought it's that funny, but it is a valuable exercise. Just okay, when we think about the environment, which of course is resources we all rely on, are we thinking about them as something that needs to be protected? And if you assume that we are all, in some respect, rational actors seeking to maximize something, are we really thinking about the environment as protection in a way we would expect someone to be a steward of our money, of our resources? And the short answer is, I think the laws are pretty good, but what's happened in the implementation is pretty awful, especially the last couple of years, and it helps to think through this exercise. So, prudent investor. Again, this is like going back to Econ 101. So, what will a prudent investor do? A prudent investor will consider the best information, right? No one's going to take money and just ignore the most important, best data. They will look at the best information. You would think about upside risks and downside risks, right? What's good that could happen, what disastrous could happen. You will rely on the maximum data you can pull together, and you look at it over multiple time frames, right? You don't just think about immediate short-term success, you think about longer term and what would happen. You always are thinking about stewardship, right? You protect the capital, and you think about expanding the pie, and you make sure you don't destroy what you have. You also are skeptical, right? You assume everyone's going to act in self-interest, so you're a little bit wary. You check your wallet. If you hand someone your money, you make sure they're watching out for it for you. Similarly, you do look at the costs and the benefits of your choices, right? You try to kind of assess, where could this go? If you're too pessimistic, nothing good happens. If you're too optimistic, then you may squander and everything will be lost. So, if you talk to people who really work in this realm, you basically have to have hedging of risks, right? You never put all of your eggs in one basket. Now, that's enough. That's all my prudent investor talk. So, what about the environmental laws? But the environmental laws actually reflect very similar judgments. And Michael's comments, I thought, were the most optimistic comment I've heard about the environment in several years. I was so heartened by that. But I do actually agree. The laws themselves are excellent, but laws are a human institution, right? Or the implementation is an institution. So I just want to point out a few great things. One, our laws aren't perfect, but they are genuinely protective, right? I mean, you can have someone like Lois Gibbs who takes on some of the most powerful corporations, and our laws are transformed so everyone has to handle hazardous waste better, right? On the other hand, it's an ongoing battle. These things are never done. But the law is filled with strategies to be prudent and protective. All of our laws, as written and as now interpreted, require attention to the best science, data, health impacts, environmental risks, and consideration of alternatives. That sounds kind of similar, right? Similarly, the laws don't rely on one actor. The reason why California is so important, and New York and Massachusetts and Minnesota, Texas with wind, is that the states have protected rights to do more, right? We have this thing called floor preemption. States can't do less. They can't just go right down to the bottom, but they have this right to innovate and to do more as long as they don't bring things into direct conflict. That's critically important. That's kind of like diversity of investing and being skeptical about the person handling it. All three branches under our environmental laws remain players, as do the states. And then in addition, in one of the really genius pieces of our law, which is now a model around the world, but was an innovation, we have delegated enforcement. So we actually have federal laws that rely on tiered delegations where the states and local governments end up playing critical roles, meaning everyone kind of becomes expert and everyone gets buy-in. And I should pause here to say, so like we have here at present, I just note, Stan Myberg, who's right there in the center, is now a professor at Wake Forest. He was the deputy administrator for the region, but he was also the #2 person at the Obama administration at EPA during the last 2 years, roughly, I believe, Stan? The last 2 years of the Obama administration, when if you look, some of the critical water protecting actions and climate protecting actions happen. So he's someone who has really been, as was Gwen, really at the steering wheel as federal laws were they were given teeth with regulations and handed to states and local governments to do things. So they know firsthand how this works, but the federal government cannot do it all on its own, and that's a brilliant thing here. Similarly, companies can do better, right? Just to be clear, despite what you hear sometimes from senators who know nothing when they say, the law is rigid and unmoving and unyielding and it's idiotic. Actually, our law virtually never tells anyone how to do something. The law tells people what to achieve. It's called performance standards. And so it is a myth that our laws actually generally prohibit mandates to do a particular thing. That is also an interesting, innovative regulatory choice, that's why you can have a Volvo or other companies coming up with better innovations, right? That's why you can have solar people coming up with better ways to produce energy with minimal pollution. Markets reward innovators. It's also true in environmental law. Our environmental laws have kept on setting up tough hurdles to meet, and markets have responded. and generally at a fraction of the cost of what industry claims, okay? And so that's an area where the environment and investment dynamics are actually very much joined. Good, aggressive goals and real laws, meaning really implemented and enforced, lead to change, and that's one of the great successes. And if anyone's interested in that, a professor named Leslie McAllister, unfortunately died about a year and a half ago, she wrote a number of articles where she studied, here's what industry claimed, the disaster that would befall them with laws, and then studied what actually happened. And each time the claim was they would be up here, and then the costs actually were down here, kind of strategic exaggeration. Now, despite all of this, I sound optimistic almost, you know, why do we still have these problems, right? In other words, why is climate unaddressed? Why are waters of the United States under threat yet again? Why is chlorpyrifos about to contaminate or continue contaminating workers in our water and the environment? And why can you have situations like battles in Louisiana over the Formosa plant, if any of you follow it? But why can you still have these terrible, terrible situations? And the reason is several-fold. One is the law is only as real as it is in its enforced, implemented reality. Okay? So clinics are critical for that, but governments, you know, absolutely have to play a role. We are now in a period where the cop is off the federal beat in substantial part, and that causes really harmful effects. So then what do you do, right? You know, so why is there this problem? So I think one big element here is that we should all pay attention to is the law does require this attention to best science, best data, and the like. And so with all of these big environmental rollbacks, people have been suing saying, you know, show me the science, show me the data, show me these claims about monetary costs. And generally, these rollbacks that are coming from the, I'm going to say it, the Trump administration, they have not been backed up with data. And so the Trump administration, with a lot of its rollbacks, is losing about 90% of the challenges to its action. Usually agencies win 70 to 90%. It's flipped, okay, because they're not doing their work and the science doesn't back up what they're doing. Similarly, as far as other problems, citizen suits have all been critical. This is the ability of citizens to sue, largely because of Supreme Court and a few opinions by Justice Scalia, but then substantially alleviated by subsequent decisions. Standing is a problem. That is, the ability of people to go to court to challenge, especially broad illegality, is very difficult these days. It's not impossible, but it is an issue, okay? So the cop is a little bit off the beat. Citizens, as enforcers, have a harder time getting into court, and I think there, Justices Kavanaugh and Gorsuch are probably going to be a problem. Similarly, as people have talked about, environmental law does not deal well with aggregate risk problems. Lots of people doing things, lots of people driving in Atlanta, even if all these cars are virtuous cars, you know, and the people pure of heart. Nonetheless, you can have major aggregate problems that arise. And there are some strategies to deal with this, but it is a thorny problem that really requires, frankly, it requires on-the-ground battles at the local, state, and federal level to figure out in each environment, how do you avoid these cumulative exacerbations of substantial risks that very often victimize the most vulnerable, the elderly, the young, often people who are poor, and often people of color. You know, this, let me see, hold on a second, pausing for a moment. You know, I have to just like pause. Climate change itself, we kind of mentioned at different points, is a huge issue, okay? So, you know, I talked about thinking like a prudent investor. I've always think that, should I be thinking like an oncologist who looks at cancer or a prudent investor with climate? If climate change were cancer, this country would have undergone major surgery and the world would have 25 years ago, right? I mean, the science is so overwhelming about the reality of climate change and human contributions and the risks that are already coming down the pike that if we were thinking about money or a cancer, action absolutely would be taken. No one would invest based on the kind of ignoring of reality we have going on now with climate. And so that is a huge issue, and part of the reason that's a source for pessimism is climate change affects every single thing we're talking about, right? Environmental injustices are going to go up with weather disasters, storm disasters. Poor neighborhoods tend to be vulnerable neighborhoods. Areas that are short of water are going to experience more water. It's harder on workers. Agricultural workers suffer terribly with heat waves and the like. And so climate science is almost a perfect distillation of all the problems of what's not happening with our law. Similarly, something that I think is worth noting is environmental law actually has come to embrace market-oriented regulation. And that's long been the case, actually going back to the famous Chevron case, which allowed essentially pollution trading within facilities. And there's a track record now that market-based regulation essentially is it's not the answer. It doesn't set the level, but whatever the goal is, allowing pollution trading within especially a small unit, tends to be cost-effective. So you would think, and this, by the way, came out of innovations out of the Chicago School and economists and Republican administrations in the past, and yet when the climate bills were proposed in 2009 and 10, modeled on longstanding Republican Chicago School models of ways to incentivize reduced emissions of greenhouse gases, it was caricatured as, central management, Soviet-style central planning, and really skewered based on completely inaccurate claims. I'm not sure what the prudent investor parallel would be there, except to say that it really was completely ignoring not just the underlying problem, but what the track record of history shows about ways to handle environmental problems. Now you're all depressed, okay? Now, sources for hope. Okay, how do we emerge from this? I think one, right off the bat, is it's important to remember that environmental law is fundamentally based on, including natural resources, environmental justice, and pollution, is all based on kind of a stewardship norm, right? Which is very much the way you think about investment, which is, that whatever you have, you always have to think about being a steward of it if it matters to you. And it is rare that anyone would ever despoil and destroy something they depend on. Right? And so the stewardship norm remains really important, and basically pollution is waste, right? I mean, every time people have been told to do better with polluting and control their pollution, they've almost invariably done better. They've found that pollution was waste. They find ways to do better. It's often just old entrenched ways are hard to surrender. So I think, one, think about the stewardship norm. It's in the laws, so we have something to hang our hats on, and there's a lot to back up it being a sound decision. Second, we should stick with environmental law's best attributes, okay? With people's despair about the current state of implementation and enforcement, it's just important to remember our environmental laws really are remarkable. They are a political, economic miracle, and I especially emphasize their pervasive insistence on using the best science and data. That's good. We should never run from good science and data. This delegated program and the preservation of state and local turf, that's terrific. Performance standards, excellent. Flexibility, as several people mentioned, both enforcement and both Gwen and Michael mentioned. The flexibility of ways to achieve environmental goals is something our laws protect, and that is a brilliant thing and should be embraced. Okay. However, or next, how do we get there? Organizing and monitoring, illuminating, and suing the derrieres of people who violate the law is critical. I mean, if you look at the history of environmental law, it has never been just a kind of happy stroll in the park where everyone agrees, my God, you're right. I feel terrible. I'll change my way I'm polluting. It's always involved pressure and organization and illuminating bad actors, and if they're evil, pointing out they're evil. Now, very often they're not evil. They may just be in bureaucracies and they're kind of blind to what they're doing, but it always takes organization, it always takes illumination, and often takes litigation. There was a famous environmentalist in town named Ogden Doremus years ago. I mean, he died a few years ago, but years ago I was in a meeting, and in criticizing, we were talking about how to handle something, and Ogden, who was, I'm not from Georgia, my great-grandfather was from Georgia, but Ogden had a very heavy Southern accent, which I won't try to imitate, but he said, criticizing somebody. He says, "You're just playing in the woods. You're just playing in the rivers." He was criticizing. He goes, "We have to sue the bastards." And so he always was saying, you can't just play, you know. And he really was criticizing someone for being, I think, too generous, or maybe not doing the hard work of challenging. So organization is critical, but it works. Why did we not have coal plants expanded in South Georgia? Because a series of groups, including Green Law, Sierra Club, basically had people in residence year after year, a multiple-year permitting battle over one power plant, and it was defeated. Why? Because they were required to do state-of-the-art controls, which made it expensive. So it matters. It can help things. I think also people do have to just focus on agencies. Are they doing their work? Are they looking at the best data? They can be forced to. They often don't. Another one, as a reason for both optimism and pessimism, is, you know, laws work when they think about human beings and how they actually behave. And some of our laws are written in ways that are very good in their mandates, but don't think about actual behavior. So there's this whole field called behavioral economics, which studies how people make common mistakes and are entrenched in their ways. And I'll just give you an example of something that I think we all just have to think about as we decide where to organize and protest and fight. You know, I was recently outside a school in Washington. I think Washington did vote something like 94% for Clinton over Trump. It's a very liberal city, that is true, and it's highly educated. And I was going by a school, and there were a bunch of cars waiting to pick people up. It was a mild, spring-like Washington winter day, but not cold. Every car was sitting there idling, okay? All of them, and most of them were SUVs, okay? And so that's just an example for me. You know, it's not all going to be enough to just tell people. Like, that's an area where I think technology has to adjust for the human tendency to want to have your heater on and to charge your phone, or not to turn your car off. But bottom line is, strategies need to be tailored to human behavior. I think last couple things I'd say is before I close and we open to questions, is this idea of enforcement being important. It's really most important for the polluters, okay? If you're the polluter, if you're the state-of-the-art company, I was talking to some former students here who work for some of America's leading corporations, you know, they can't win in the market if their best efforts are undercut by bad actors who get away with it, okay? And so there's just no escaping. You have to make sure the law is real. Monitoring has to be real. Enforcement has to be real, and there have to be real sanctions when someone skirts the law. That's an area where it's hard to force the government to act, but clinics and not-for-profits are essential, okay? And so, but that's oddly one of these areas where, frankly, corporate America should be standing up now and saying, in response to these rollbacks, this is bad. Okay? They should be saying this is bad because it's destroying the market advantage of the best companies. And I've heard this from people. One major industry, I happened to be walking in D.C. with one of their lobbyists, and I said, well, what do you think about this? You know, are your clients happy? And she goes, no, they're really unhappy. This is terrible for them. And I'm like, well, I haven't seen that. They go, well, we feel like we have to applaud environmental rollbacks, you know, and we don't want to get into the target of the, you know, the sights of the Trump administration. And yet, this deregulation has cut out the market advantage where they were producing products that would have been the state of the art for the world. And so there are problems here, and I hope that corporate America will start speaking up, saying it's not in our interests. You know, I guess the last thing I'd say, just by reason of optimism, is that or just a lesson. I think all of you here, and it really is a remarkable gathering of the best environmental talent in the area, and just dozens of people who I've known for years, and so I'm happy to be here. But we all may know why we think the environment matters, but people don't. That is, you really, like a prudent investor, you have to, if an investor said, I want to put all my money in Bitcoin, you know, you might say, not a good idea, right? That may be a disastrous thing. Similarly, when we're talking about protecting the environment, it's always important to explain the why, right? Be prepared to say, we should do it for the following 5 reasons in which you have self-interest. You destroy this watershed, the farmers will die, the crops will die, and the drinking water will be contaminated. You don't just say, we have to think about protecting waters of the United States. So I just want to say that as a last point, it's just, it really is important for people to always be ready to justify the why. Why do you man the barricades? Why do you bring the suit? Why do you support a Turner Environmental Law Clinic? It's because the values and the underlying resources are critical. So I'll stop there and turn to questions, but thank you.
I want to thank all of our panelists, and I think I'll kickstart or jumpstart the question with something that kept running through my mind as I listened to people present. Our laws have been effective, but each of you talked about some of the missing factors in our laws. So my question is, do we need a new paradigm for regulating our environmental protection efforts? In particular, I was thinking about how our laws are, our federal laws are based on the single media strategy, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, dealing with waste, and our most troublesome environmental problems today come from aggregate pollution, come from pollution in mixed media. And another thing that I think Gwen pointed out was in the environmental justice area. There are no laws that specifically address environmental justice. We do that by interpreting the laws that we have, using the authority of the executive order for environmental justice. So there are obvious gaping holes in the way our environmental regulatory paradigm is set up. So my question to you is, do we need a new one? And if we do, what elements, assuming that you could wave some magic wand over Congress and get them to work together, what elements would a new paradigm incorporate?
That's a tough question. And again, I'm a little biased because I think we got it right prior to 2016. I do think there are opportunities for improvement. I think we do have to recognize the aggregate impact that communities experience. And so perhaps one of the tweaks would be to be more community focused in terms of what they are actually experiencing as opposed to focusing on one medium or the other. But I think what Professor Busbee said is right on in terms of the laws are as strong as you use them. And I know we've got some outstanding public servants in the room from EPA. And yes, give them a hand, please. I had the great honor and privilege of learning from them, including Stan Myberg. I would not be here without them. My clients know that they're using the law and still having all the tenacity that they used to have. They are not backing off at all. I think there's a difference between what happens on the ground and what happens in Washington and what you hear about. And so I think they are a tool that need to be used often. I do agree, again, with what Bill says in terms of there are companies out there, even with the Clean Power Plan, for example, who did not oppose it because they saw it as a competitive advantage that they could meet. And so it was through that process that I learned silence is a win sometimes. You may not always get an advocate in your corner, but if you can stop them from arguing against you, then that's a win. So I think it can be tweaked to be able to add an aggregate component, but I also think, like any tool, it's as good as you use it, and it needs to be used consistently applied consistently and creatively. Where there are clear absences, you've got to have people willing to think outside the box.
You know, and there are a couple of concepts that we know about today that we didn't know about 50 years ago. And science has taught us, Bill mentioned one of them, and that's cumulative impact. We know a lot about cumulative risk and cumulative impact of pollution, of right across the spectrum of environmental laws. The other thing we know about today, and states like California and others have begun to memorialize in statute, is the concept of resilience. Resilience of ecosystems, resilience of communities. We need to think about new authority that embodies those principles.
The only thing I'd add, I think those points are great. You know, the Army Corps of Engineers has long had a thing called public interest review in connection with Section 404, dredge and fill permitting, which actually is, at least as written in the regulations, is to kind of look overall, in the end, is this permit going to be a good thing? So at least in the permitting setting, that exists in Army Corps tradition and some regulations. And then similarly, the Clean Air Act has a provision in non-attainment at areas with degraded air, their permitting, that also calls for essentially a version of cost-benefit before granting a permit. I think those are good models. I think those should be more broadly in all provisions. And the other is, I've always thought, you know, that we've long had a thing called like best technology-based standards, but more or less that people have to use some form of the reasonable best ways to control a source of harm. And I sometimes think that you could have a standard like that would be focused on aggregate and community risk. So if someone's seeking to do something, that they would be obligated to come up with, you know, all reasonably prudent planning to avoid harms to vulnerable populations and others, you know, whatever the, and other important resources. It wouldn't even have to be a huge threshold, just where it would be a required source of analysis. You know, if the history of NEPA is the environmental impact statement law, you know, companies will fight like heck just to not disclose certain harms, even though the law doesn't require them to avoid them. So sometimes just disclosure is powerful, so I think we should do more of that.
Thank you. So one other question, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor. And it is, if you had to invest resources in a single strategy to jumpstart our efforts to address climate change in this country, what would you focus on?
Well, I think our panelists have hinted on this before, and that was, I think it was Bill or Gwen mentioned, market-based mechanisms. We have learned how to harness the market in favor of conservation and the environment. I've spent a lot of my career doing things like eco-labeling and developing new organizations to pursue market-based. The guru of this was Paul Hawken back in the day. Did anybody read The Ecology of Commerce? His thesis is the only thing powerful enough to turn around the unsustainable use of resources is commerce itself. And so we need to pass cap and trade legislation like we've done in California. We almost did at the national level. If we do that, we will harness the power of the market in favor of restoring our climate. And we'll get it done sooner or later. It's just a matter of time. We need to learn how to work together again, but we will.
Yes, I would probably agree with that being, and then the sub part of that would be, but you have to be careful that whatever you embrace, you have to preserve the power of state and local governments to also play in the picture. Because whatever progress you have, it can be rolled back. And again, I really worry, and it was part of the 2009-10 climate legislation battles, there were proposals to make it all federal and completely take out the power of state and local governments to act. And a group of us, it really was a group effort, was like, this would be disastrous. This would not be the way to go. And I still think that's the case. But so I would say market, but not market where you eliminate the ability of the state and local governments to do more.
I would agree with them. I think one of the things, or kind of stepping back, I would simply describe it as rewarding those that are doing good, that are doing the type of behavior you want to encourage. I think a lot of our construct is to penalize the bad actors, which obviously has its value. Again, I was prosecutor for 17 years. But I think if you can get to the space where you're either providing insurance benefits for those that mitigate risk or other, that's what I talked about in terms of thinking of non-traditional partners in this space. And I think climate risk is one where it's a great opportunity for the insurance market to be able to weigh in on what they're willing to insure and raise the standards based on an affordable model with them applying pressure in the right place.
Insurance industry is paying attention. You better believe it. Reinsurance industry as well. The companies that insure the insurance companies. They are well aware of the risk and what they're going to have to pay from climate risk. The military is well aware too because they're doing more disaster relief and humanitarian assistance than war fighting. So it's really only the politicians that don't get it. The insurance companies, the industry, and the military are ready to go. And they know that monetizing this is inevitable because they're going to be at the front end of that.
Thank you. All right, we'll take some questions from the audience.
Thank you, Anne. Your question was actually a great prelude to the question that I wanted to ask, which is there is absolutely one area where our law is insufficient, and that is on climate change. And we watched the Obama administration do the best they could, and their staff work ridiculously hard to put together creative ways to implement the Clean Air Act and make it do what we need to do. And now we're seeing it ripped out every single shred. And those lawyers of us out in the advocacy world are spending our time and energy and missing out on other things in life because we're busy trying to stop that rollback. But the reality is that even if things change in 2020, if we don't have a law, we might keep doing this over and over again. You try it again and then it gets ripped up. We don't have time. And it's actually not that long until there's a possibility of an opening. And so from my distinguished panel in front of me, who do you see that's out there? What's being done? Because it didn't work in 2009, 2010. We can't just stick that back out again and hope for the best. And so is there any possibility in the short amount of time that we have left that we have some way to change the situation and make real lasting improvements in our ability to fight climate change?
I'll give you a suggestion. I'll turn back to Lois and Love Canal. Love Canal was an icon that helped us create Superfund and CERCLA and so forth. We would not have those statutes had it not been for Love Canal, the Cuyahoga River catching on fire. Those kinds of things matter because they bring this into sharp focus in the public eye. Without that, good luck getting Congress, especially this Congress, to pass anything from a rational basis. It has to be emotional. That's what drives legislation, not science and law. That's to the earlier point. We need, I had two EPA administrators, friends of mine who will remain nameless, tell me privately that they prayed for a big oil spill because of all the good you could do on the back end of it. It takes a disaster sometimes to get us motivated.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, it's interesting because in my comments, we talked about Pennsylvania's Environmental Rights Amendment, and it came out of a lot of the disasters that happened around the coal industry back in the 1970s. And it's what brought people together. I think one of the things that we need to stop doing is this pendulum shift every 4 to 8 years and really try to work together to identify what is something that we can all live with. The challenge is, as someone just said a few minutes ago, we're not working together and we're not even trying to do that. Everybody's happy just going to their corners and yelling across the aisle at each other. And that needs to stop. That's just not effective leadership. It's not effective policy management. It's not the way to serve this country. And so we need to have folks that are really going to step up and tackle the hard issues as opposed to running away from them and finding convenience and just blaming the other side.
I would say there's maybe 3 things that I think might be catalysts to make progress on climate before it's too late. One is adaptation. People say, oh, you have mitigation, reducing the pollution that causes climate change, and adaptation, which is all the costs of adjusting in light of it. And people tend to talk about adaptation as though it's sort of, and we will adjust. And I think something that needs to be done more is people have to really be constantly monetizing and making clear the vast costs of not acting. It's just, it hasn't been part of the conversation as it should be, and it needs to be brought home. So it's emotional, but I also think it's just a different conversation if, well, you know, you, whatever your state is, you're going to be experiencing this and this and this, and you, Manhattan, are going to lose your, you know, the lower third of this, of Manhattan. And that kind of cost maybe can change the calculation. Another one is state and local governments are doing a lot. So state and local governments that are still making progress, especially with RGGI, California's trading, a number of other measures, those are valuable on their own, but also they're valuable because they're demonstrating that this kind of progress can be made without killing the economy and without, you know, making people suddenly yoked to no freedom or whatever the mockery is usually of environmental laws. And so that's really important, and that is real. And so I think those are things just to illuminate. And the last one is we should be doing research and development. I mean, the world will be saved, and this is my variant of The Graduate, where in the movie The Graduate, the guy says, plastics. Okay, so it's not plastics, but storage, which is, you talk to anyone who works in the energy realm, that is storage, that is the ability to store energy efficiently and release it, will really eliminate most of the environmental problems we have, because there's tons of energy in the world, but storage is the one part of the energy sphere that has not made progress like LED bulbs. And so there are really interesting experiments which are conservation and storage being done around the country, and some people at Texas are studying them, and then Con Ed's doing them in New York. But I actually think that storage is, once storage becomes an economical reality, that it can be done, the whole conversation will change. But it requires kind of a catalyst of political support and research and development money, and probably there's prize-based regulation where you put out a big sum of money for certain measurements. That's how we got really efficient refrigerators and a number of other things like that. I think that, light bulbs too, and I think that's an area where there should be some, like, you know, $500 million prize to whoever comes up with certain measurements of effective storage. So plastics, storage, okay.
All right. Dr. Shafi.
Hi, my name is Fatima Shafi. I'm from Spelman College. At first, I want to thank the panel for wonderful, thought-provoking presentation. My comment relates to the cap and trade that increasingly is becoming like the solution to climate change. And I have two problems with that. One is that the assumption that people have the right to pollute, and if they don't, they should be rewarded with money. To me, it seems like if you pollute, you should be taxed and penalized, rather than just because you didn't pollute, you should get rewarded. The second problem that I have with cap and trade is that it doesn't address environmental justice communities where the concentration of those pollution is. So I would like to hear your comment regarding my concern with the cap and trade. Thank you.
I wouldn't disagree with you at all. In fact, I would postulate that I have never seen a market-based mechanism that was sufficient by itself to move the needle on conservation or environment. As Bill, I think, or Gwen said, market-based mechanisms will only ever be tools to get us where we're already going. They will never supplant or replace effective and thoughtful regulation.
Yeah, I think part of the reason, you know, that you're describing, you know, could you all hear her question? Okay, you know, Suze, and you know, it is the case that cap and trade can have these distributional impacts, right? You can just recreate the Gulf Coast and the concentration of plants and the kind of concentrations of industry that can be devastating. And so it always has to have some complement of preserved authority for state and local governments when it comes to citing issues and also consideration of it, which is hard to do, but I still think, like, at least within sectors, if you set sectoral caps, it is still by far the most cost-effective way to get people within sectors to reduce pollution. And again, as I said, this work by Leslie McAllister shown, and do so at really low cost, a fraction of what people claim in advance. And so I think that's part of the reason people like it is, you know, the market does work if people know we just have to do this. People will come up with products and strategies and finances and vehicles that will do it better, but it's not complete. So I still think it's good, but it's not perfect and it's not complete.
I also agree that there are challenges with it. I think very often what happens is in that goal of compromise, things get lost, and we need to be very deliberate about what we not let get lost. There's the notion in environmental justice that if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. And it's true. I don't know how a market-based solution will adequately ever address and account for people who are not part of the market. I mean, let's, you know, dial it back in terms of the access disparity that we have in this country, whether it's financial, economic, or you talk about broadband and other things. We need to really step back and level the playing field either comprehensively or every time we take a new initiative so that nobody is left behind and nobody is sacrificed for the benefit of what is depicted as a larger good.
Thank you. We have time for one more.
Hi, my name is Dana Kahn. I'm a first-year undergraduate at Emory, and I had a question. Do you have any advice for students like myself who are interested in environmental protection as to how I can make an impact, and what things should I keep in mind as I continue on this path? Thank you.
Thank you.
Good question.
Who wants to go?
You go first, Gwen.
Gosh, I have so many things. You're here, number one. Network and shake every hand in this room. I think right now all of us want to come meet you because we think back to when we were at your point in life and are just like, gosh, I wish I was that aware. Or at least maybe I'm only telling my story here. So network is key. And take ownership, which it sounds like you're already doing. I think, you know, there are people who will tell you you're not ready, you're too young, you don't understand the big picture, we've never done it that way, or we've always done it X way. What I'm excited about is you're part of a generation who's like, bump that, this is what I want, and this is how I think we should go about doing it. The thing I would encourage you to do is partner with those of us that also want change, so that we can help guide you through and avoid pitfalls. We're here to help. And sometimes the younger generation thinks, just because I want it, it's going to get done. And I think it's just a real opportunity for us to work together. So I'll give you my card when we're done.
One, I hope you have a great education here. It's great you're here in a law school event coming across the campus. This is unheard of. But the, and so I guess I'd say several things. One is Emory's an incredibly intellectually rich place, and so you're at a great place. You know, the environmental, I can't remember what's called, environmental science or studies these days, but has some phenomenal people. There's great opportunities there. You know, I think it's a great liberal arts school, and so I think you should just richly learn about everything. You know, as far as basic skills, I think knowing some economics helps a lot. I think meeting people, developing pragmatic judgment where you have a sense kind of why things work and don't work is something that you kind of learn over time, and it helps to go to events like this because it will just get you thinking. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I'd say. You know, there's various corporations that occasionally hold events on subjects that are open to the public, and they often get really interesting people, and so I think actually if you're interested in the environment, understanding how the nation's largest commercial actors and often polluters, how they think and work, whether you like them or you don't, it's helpful to kind of get exposed. So whether it's business school events or across town, I think that's a nice opportunity, but I'm sure you'll get a great education.
I have a 16-year-old son. I wonder if you'd like to come and talk him off of video games, you know. Just two quick pieces of advice. One is volunteer for everything you can find and put it on your resume. The volunteerism, when I hire somebody, I look at what do they do in their spare time? What's their real passion? And it should come through, you know, in your volunteerism. The other thing is consider, you know, I realize we're in the law school, but I tell this to my students that are pursuing PhDs, and consider going to law school. You have to be an academic masochist to get a PhD and a law degree, but nonetheless, a law degree is really versatile. You can use it. Most of the lawyers I know don't practice. They don't litigate. They work in policy. They work in, you know, having a law degree in Washington, D.C. is like having a pilot's license in Alaska. Everyone has one. And they use them in all kinds of different ways. If you crash and burn in environmental law, you can always write wills and divorces. You know, it's an extremely versatile thing to do. So good luck, and thanks for being here.
I want to thank our panelists. It was very excellent discussion, excellent presentations. Thank Mindy. There is a lot of work to be done in this space, but I am encouraged that we have great minds attuned to this problem, and I look forward to future opportunities to interact with all of you as we try to make a positive difference in the environment we live in. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mindy.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you for a truly, truly, truly incredible panel. And what a great question to end on. I didn't plant that one, but if I could, I would have. I really appreciate you all. So thank you. Do you want to sit here or closing remarks? You can go down, whatever you prefer.
Go down.
Okay.
Closing.
All right. As they walk off the stage, I just wanted to take a few seconds to thank all of you for coming to this, I think, really exciting celebration of where the next 20 years of environmental law will take us. I think that a nice way to end would be on some reflections from our law students who have participated in the environmental law program and the environmental law clinic here to tell you what they think of their experiences and what the future of environmental law may be. So Alex and Jamie, if y'all want to come up.
Well, hi, I'm Alex Pierce, and I'm a 3L in my second semester of the Turner Clinic. And after graduation, I'll be moving out to Colorado to clerk for a judge in the Colorado State Court of Appeals.
Hi, I'm Jamie Allen. I'm also a 3L, and I've completed 2 semesters of clinic. And after graduation, I'll be returning to my home state to practice at a firm in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
So the western side of the United States will have some more representation here. So first we wanted to just reflect somewhat on our experiences in the clinic and how it's shaping where we're going today. While I was in the clinic, I had the privilege of working alongside so many incredible heroes of environmental law. First, I worked on an issue around the Department of Interior's failure to provide information on the decisions that it had been making regarding our public lands. And the clinic worked alongside Sharon Buccino of the Natural Resources Defense Council, as well as Seema Kakade of the Maryland Clinic, who you heard from today. Now I'm working on a matter with Diane Curran of Beyond Nuclear, and we will be going to New Mexico next week, Western state again, to a hearing on this issue before the Atomic Safety and Licensing Board. As someone who wants to be a litigator and go out and fight people, the clinic has gone beyond the classroom to prepare me to think creatively and strategically in pursuing those issues that I care about so deeply. And it has afforded me an incredible opportunity to work with people who've laid this groundwork for us.
Similar to Alex, I've had some significant experiences in clinic, and I've been able to have the opportunity to do work in both litigation and transactional work. And on the transactional side, we were able to draft a memorandum of understanding to help get farmers onto land and actually support a local sustainable food movement. On the litigation side, I was able to help research and formulate arguments in the nuclear litigation that Alex referred to. And not only were we able to work on issues that really matter to us and to everyone, but we were able to get invaluable practical experience applying the things that we learned in our classes in the environmental program. And I would be remiss if I didn't take a minute to say just a couple of things about Emory's environmental law program in general. So collectively, Alex and I have taken every environmental law class that has been offered in our time here, so we can certainly speak to how great the program is. From the introductory environmental class to natural resources to environmental advocacy, Emory's program offers an array of classes that really teach you the ins and the outs of the statutes. And not only that, but the professors that teach these classes are amazing, and many of them are here. But many, as you know, many are practicing attorneys that can really give you the insight to the practical side of applying these statutes. But you know as well as I do that it doesn't matter how much you hear about applying the statutes or how much insight you may get, it doesn't really come full circle until you get to apply them yourself. So the reason that really is, I think, is because environmental law is changing so quickly. I mean, it's true for any area of law, but environmental in particular, because we're dealing with constant change and always trying to keep up with politics, as some of the panels have discussed. And Alex is going to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so as Jamie said, we have taken full advantage of all the opportunities at Emory Law to pursue our interest in the environment, and that has meant taking a lot of classes. But the environmental law work of today and of tomorrow doesn't really fit neatly within the boxes that casebooks try to create. Although reading the opinion for Rapanos and trying to figure out what the hell a water of the United States is another story. Rather, it has been the clinic that has taught us our most important skill going forward, to think outside of the box. From Juliana and Our Children's Trust, where a group of kids are asserting a public trust claim against the government for the harms caused by its contribution to climate change, to presidential actions to shrink national monuments that has brought the Antiquities Act back into the spotlight, and the numerous minds to be changed and victories to be won through the court of public opinion, environmental law is constantly shifting in ways in which it is no longer enough to simply know what the law is, to be an effective attorney and a steward of the environment. Through the Turner Clinic and the leadership of Mindy, we have learned to give a reporter a quote on some seemingly impossible to understand nuclear matter that they will actually want to publish, to communicate effectively with clients and co-counsel, to help give voice to those communities that are often forgotten. And most importantly, the clinic has prepared us to anticipate the unique challenges facing the field of environmental law ahead.
Now, thinking about all this change, especially as we're entering our careers, is honestly a bit scary. But far outweighing that fear is excitement. It's excitement to pursue careers where we can actually make a difference. It's excitement to pick up the mantle from those that actually laid the groundwork, from you, and to pave the way for those that come after us. And finally, it's excitement to enter a field where we'll be lucky enough to call you all our colleagues. I mean, seriously, like, you guys are amazing. We look forward to calling on you all in the future, and we thank you guys for being such wonderful role models, and thank you for celebrating the clinic's 20th anniversary with us.
I couldn't have said any of that any better. Thank you so much. I didn't even read their remarks beforehand. That's how much I trust them. Okay, with that, I think that we can close this conference with a celebration to all of your work and to the exciting things that lay ahead of us. There is cake out back, so please help yourself on the way out, and thank you for coming.